Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Hey, Tampa Bay! It's just Morgan Streetman today. Roxanne Wilder's still out, but she's doing well. We got an update from her recently, and she's doing well. Glad to be back home resting with her new child, her new daughter. And Pat George is out again today. He was at Tampa Bay Home Show, one of the largest, I think the largest home show in Tampa Bay over the weekend. So he's still out there finishing up today. And, of course, last week we had Schreiner on the show with us, filling in, but he's out today. So today we've got Mark Charles. We haven't had Mark Charles on in a long time.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's glad to have you back, Mark. Well, before we jump into the main story of the day, which I'm sure you can only imagine what that's going to be, wanted to take a quick look back at a story. And even before I do that, I want to tell you, if you want to get on the line with us today and talk about any of the stories that we're going to talk about, including the big story of the day, you feel free to give us a call at 888-404-1010, and we'd be glad to hear from you. And so before we jump into some of the big stories that I'm sure you're all chomping at the bit to talk about and what's been dominating the news lately, wanted to take just a minute to cover a story that you probably haven't heard anything about, but we have covered this story before. Now, this is a story we covered back in the midsummer. I think it was June or July we covered this. And that's a story about a company called Metalla Royalty and Streaming. And if you remember, we had the CEO of Metalla and one of their directors on the show, actually. We spent most of the show talking to them about their company, what they do. They're a precious metals, mainly gold and silver streaming company, which is a finance thing that they do in mining because, you know, mining is very expensive. There's a lot of what they call CapEx or capital expenditures that are involved in setting up a mine and running a mine. So people that run gold and silver mines, they need a lot of cash to get going and maintain operations. And so what they do is they sell off little pieces of future streams of the actual precious metals coming out of the mine, and that's called royalty streaming, and that's a finance process used in mining. So this company, Metalla Royalty and Streaming, that's what they do. They're involved in providing capital to mining companies in exchange for a portion of what comes out of the mine. Now, as you all know, we're not investment advisors, and this really isn't an investment show, but we have given you some interesting things to think about over the years. And certainly if you had thought about the things that we had mentioned to you and decided to take action on them, you might have done quite well, including Metalla Royalty and Streaming, the stock price of which has more than doubled since we featured their executives on the show last summer. Now, you'll also note that the gold price is going nuts right now. It's up at about $1,575 right before we went on the air, and that no doubt has something to do with the big story that we'll be talking about today and the uncertainties worldwide. But also, Metalla is about to list on the New York Stock Exchange. They'll start trading on the New York Stock Exchange effective January 8th. So we expect more good things to come from Metalla in the near future, and it's very responsive to the price of gold. So as the price of gold goes up, the output of the mines that Metalla has negotiated to obtain in exchange for financing, the value of those goes up dramatically. So right now the U.S. gold price is $1,575, and who knows where it's going to go. I mean, we've previously seen it as high as almost $2,000, and we're expecting, those of us that follow it, something similar to that. So you might want to look into Metalla, even though it's had a huge run, particularly more recently as it gets ready to list on the New York Stock Exchange. It has had a huge run, and it'll be listing under the ticker symbol MTA, effective on Wednesday. So you can check it out online, metallaroyalty.com, and that's METALLA royalty.com. All right, well, let's jump in now to the big story of the day. And boy, has a lot happened since we've been with you last week. I'll tell you what. We were with you right before New Year's Eve, and everything seemed to be going okay, right? All of a sudden, as of this week, everybody's talking about World War III. We're about to get into World War III this week. Well, the big news last week, the big news was the attack on our embassy that happened on about December 31st, so right around the New Year's Eve date, by Kataib Hezbollah, which is a group associated with the Hezbollah group, which is associated with Hamas, which is associated with basically all of the terrorist organizations run out of the Muslim Brotherhood side of things, and closely associated with the Iranians, funded, trained, equipped by the Iranians, at least the Iranian leadership. And we want to be careful because we don't want to prejudice the idea that the Iranian people are bad people. I mean, they're living under a theocratic regime that's been in place since the late 70s, since the Islamic Revolution there, so-called, quote-unquote, revolution, led by Khomeini. And, you know, they have not necessarily chosen the path that's been visited upon them. In fact, if you look at photographs of Iran prior to the so-called Islamic Revolution there, you'll see that Iran was a very prosperous country with open Western values, and people seemed very happy. They were very style-oriented. They had a lot of nice things. They were dressing nice. They looked very much like Westerners and were enjoying that lifestyle, apparently. And now, of course, they have a much different lifestyle in Iran, where they're not allowed to communicate freely. They're not allowed to watch the television that they want to watch, and that's why they all have these satellite dishes to try and get the information in from the West. They're not allowed to wear the clothes that they might want to wear. And this has been going on for, 40 years now. So, you know, our hearts go out to the Iranian people who are stuck in this situation, and certainly we don't identify them with the Iranian leadership. But, of course, the leadership is in charge, and they have control over the resources of the country and the military aspects of the country. And what they've been doing over the past, about a decade, or actually it's been about 15 years, to be honest, is they've involved themselves heavily in Iraq. And that happened because we went into Iraq and deposed Saddam Hussein militarily and thereby destabilized the country. Now, the country of Iraq is a majority Shia country. I don't know if you remember the distinctions between the Sunnis and the Shias. They're to those of us in the West, they're pretty minute sounding. In other words, we don't necessarily understand what the big deal is, but to folks involved in Islam, it's a big deal, the distinction between the Sunnis and the Shia. And, of course, Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party were Sunni-oriented in Iraq. And so they were about 20%, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, of the population, and they governed over the 80% Shia population. Of course, we came in and deposed Saddam Hussein and threw that order into chaos, and the Shia started to assert themselves as you would naturally expect them to do in the country of Iraq. Well, Iran is a majority Shia country, and so naturally, when the Shias in Iraq began to assert themselves, the Iranian leadership got involved in that and began to build up its influence in the country of Iraq. And that's been going on for a decade and a half, or maybe even a little more. So it's been going on for a long time. They've been involved in Iraq, and they've been building alliances, asserting influence there. And a lot of that came to a head last week when, on December 31st, they had this terrorist offshoot group of Hezbollah attack the U.S. Embassy. Now, the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, in Baghdad, is very highly secured. So the truth is they didn't get very far, but they did get into the embassy. They didn't get into the secure portion of it, but they got into essentially the public portion of the embassy and were destroying things and rioting, generally acting badly. And what's important to note about that is that an embassy is the sovereign territory of the country whose embassy it is. So even though this is in Baghdad, Iraq, when they came into the U.S. Embassy using violent force to get into it, that is the equivalent of violating U.S. sovereignty, of invading U.S. territory. Now, that may not seem like a big deal to some people, but that's a huge deal. That's a huge violation of sovereignty, and they are upping the ante against the U.S. And we can talk about, we're going to get into some of the things that they've done previously, like shooting down our drones and other actions that they've taken previously. And this was a clear escalation. So then we're going to talk about what did President Trump say about that, and then what did he do about that. And most of you know the answer to some of that, but we're going to get into some of the interesting details that you may not know, and also talk about some of what may be coming in the near future as we wait to see what all the fallout is from this situation. We'll be right back on the Morgan Streetman Show. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Today it's just Morgan Streetman here with you, which is, I'm sure, a treat for many of you. And if you'd like to get on the horn with us, the number to call is 888-404-1010. Little joke there for you. Anyway, we also have Mark Charles today, so he's probably keeping quiet over there, knowing what a firebrand I could be, especially on some of these topics. But we're glad to have him with us today. And soon Pat George will be back. He'll be back next week. And, you know, Roxanne is coming back eventually, so it'll probably just be a few months. But we look forward to her return. And, of course, after the show today, you can hang around and listen to Schreiner. I'm sure he's going to cover a lot of these topics as well, because there's so much interesting stuff to talk about and so much detail involved on what's going on over in Iran and Iraq. And so we'll pick up where we left off, and that is, you know, last week we talked about the embassy, or we talked about what happened last week, which was the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Baghdad was attacked and essentially invaded by this terrorist group related to Hezbollah, and which is an offshoot of really the big terrorist organization that's operating in the Middle East under the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. And, you know, you got to look into some of that. We've covered a lot of that on the show before. You know, we've covered some of the connections between the Muslim Brotherhood and these terrorist organizations. And, for instance, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is not what it would appear to be. According to court documents, in cases like the Holy Land Foundation case, where CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, was an unindicted co-conspirator with these terrorist organizations. It's involved in funding the terrorist organizations. And we've had guests on before, and you can check out our archives. We've had Chris Gabbets on before, who's talked about that, where he actually went undercover at the CARE office in Falls Church, Virginia, and basically determined what they were really doing. And they're operating as a wolf in sheep's clothing. So they want to appear to be an organization that's dedicated towards improving relations between America and Islam, but in fact, their real goal is to undermine America and to fund terrorists. But back to what's going on in the Middle East in what they call the Shia Crescent, which is Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and this is the area in which Iran is operating basically with free rein currently, and in which Qasem Soleimani, who was the Iranian general who was just killed last week, he was operating throughout that region without any sort of barrier to his operation. He was traveling all over the region. There are pictures of him throughout Syria at various times. He was organizing the training and the military operations, and that's what these are. These are military operations that were occurring. They may look like terrorist attacks, and the media may tell you that there's some kind of, random occurrence. Just the crowd in the street just gets an idea to go and invade the U.S. embassy, but that's actually not correct. These are planned military operations, and what they're doing is they're testing the United States, and they're pushing the limit to see just how far they can go. You remember the Iranians just last year shot down one of our drones that they said had invaded their airspace. And, of course, at that time, President Trump didn't take any military action in response. And, it makes a lot of sense because they just destroyed some materiel, some military weaponry. Now, it's very expensive military weaponry, but they didn't kill anybody. And I think President Trump's position was that, we can give up some materiel. We can expect to lose some in operation. So while he told them basically don't do it again and we're not happy with what you've done, he didn't create a military situation. He didn't do a military strike to follow on to that. And then, of course, you saw the Iranians start to seize some oil tankers. And again, they were not punished militarily for that action. In other words, we didn't go to war with them. But what happened to the embassy was a clear escalation of what's been going on in the region, and that is the invasion of American territory and the violation of American sovereignty at the embassy. There were also Americans who were killed. Specifically, I think there was a contractor who was killed. And following that, and let me just say, isn't it interesting when you juxtapose the response to what happened to the embassy in Baghdad with the U.S. response to what happened to the Libyan embassy in Benghazi? If you remember, in Benghazi, they were calling for help. The folks in the embassy were calling for help, and no help was ever sent. I think Hillary Clinton was just sleeping through the situation and frankly, obviously didn't care. And as she would go on to say in congressional testimony later, at this point, what does it matter, right? I mean, these people are dead. Well, it's a big deal. You didn't do your job. You didn't send in the military. You didn't protect U.S. citizens abroad when you could have at least tried. I mean, if you tried and failed, that's one thing. But to not even try at all is really shocking. But now look at how President Trump responds, and it's totally differently. He immediately sends over these rapid reaction forces. He sent over about 1,000 troops right away, as fast as we could get them there. He sent the Apache helicopters, which were, shooting off flares to try and disperse the crowd, essentially, and let the crowd know who was invading the embassy. And again, this is not a spontaneous demonstration. This was a planned military action by the Iranians using their proxies in Iraq. And the action is to try and push the envelope and see what's the U.S. going to do. Are we still dealing with Barack Hussein Obama, who's going to tell us everything's okay, do whatever you want to do, essentially. In fact, we'll send you some money. We want to be your friends, and so we'll put up with whatever you want to do to us, including being involved in the Benghazi embassy invasion. We'll put up with whatever you want to do to us because we want to be your friends. That was the message of the Obama administration. And the Iranians wanted to test and find out, okay, what's going to happen now? We've tested President Trump's administration a couple of times, and frankly, nothing's happened. How much further can we push this envelope? Well, last week, I think they found out exactly how much further they can push the envelope. So right after the embassy was invaded, President Trump took decisive action. And then as he's prone to do, he went to Twitter. And why does he go to Twitter? People say, God, I hate the way he tweets everything. I don't like his tweets, etc. Well, he certainly can't rely on the mainstream media to convey his messages. He can't rely on the mainstream media to get the message that he wants to get out to the people. So he has to go to Twitter because that's his only means of talking to the people and telling them what's really going on. And I want to read to you his tweet because this preceded the assassination that then took place later. And the tweet says, the U.S. Embassy in Iraq is and has been for hours safe. Many of our great warfighters, together with the most lethal military equipment in the world, was immediately rushed to the site. Thank you to the President and Prime Minister of Iraq for their rapid response upon request. Iran will be held fully responsible for lives lost or damage incurred at any of our facilities. They will pay a very big price. This is not a warning, it's a threat. Happy New Year. Well, it wasn't too long after those tweets that we got to find out exactly how happy of a new year it was going to be for Iran's military, because on January 2nd, the supreme military commander in Iran, a man named Qasem Soleimani, was assassinated. Now, you would think, okay, well, he's assassinated somewhere in Iran, right? Because he should be in Iran. He's an Iranian general, right? No. He was assassinated in Baghdad, Iraq. Why? Because he was over there in Baghdad conducting and leading these military operations, of which the attack on the embassy was one. And apparently they had further attacks planned, and they were going to use their terrorist proxies so that they've got what's called plausible deniability to say, oh, we didn't have anything to do with this. It's just our general running around, planning everything, funding everything, providing the weaponry. I mean, this man was responsible for killing hundreds of U.S. citizens throughout the years in Iraq because the Iranians are the ones who trained the Iraqis on how to create these IEDs that we heard so much about a couple of decades ago, the roadside bombs that killed so many of our troops, and beyond just killed, also wounded. I mean, think about the number of people that we've got walking around who don't have all of their limbs now because they were in a convoy that was hit by one of these IEDs while they were in Iraq. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. So this man was a worldwide terrorist. He hated America, and he was killed last week. And we're going to give you some of the details on exactly how he was killed, because this is something I haven't heard the media covering, and I bet you don't know a whole lot about this yet. But we got a little bit of inside information from some of our sources on exactly what they did to kill this man, and then how they identified that they had gotten him. And then we're going to get into some other interesting stuff in the time that we have left, including we're going to try to hit impeachment, a little bit of trade talk. And for our out there, we got to go back to the well on Epstein after 60 Minutes last night. We'll be right back on the Morgan Streetman Show. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. We're going to try to speed through some of this stuff because there are so many interesting stories today, one of which Mark Charles just mentioned to me. And we won't have time to really get to it, but if you haven't seen the Ricky Gervais speech, is it Gervais or Gervais?
I think you had it right the first time.
Gervais, okay. If you go see his speech from the Golden Globes last night, I mean, it's absolutely hilarious. I mean, he just opens up on the folks that are there, on the Hollywood elites, or so-called elites. And it's well worth taking a few minutes to watch that 7 or 8 minute opening speech that he gives. Because he says it's the last time he'll be doing the Golden Globes. And I think after that speech, there's little doubt as to that. But it is something to see, folks. Very, very funny stuff. Well, we want to kind of jump back in because we got to finish talking about this stuff going on over in Iran. And it'll be a story to be talked about over many, many weeks now because we got to wait and see what's going to happen next. But, of course, last week, very dramatically, Qasem Soleimani, the supreme military commander in the state of Iran, was assassinated. Now, he was assassinated in Baghdad, Iraq. Now, I wanted to share a couple of things with you that you may not be aware of. And one, you'll hear the media tell you that he was the head of the Quds Force. That's Quds, Quds Force. And, of course, that's a transliteration of either the Arabic or the Farsi, depending on who's saying Quds. But I wanted to point something out that the media often won't tell you, and that is, do you know what Quds means? Because they don't often tell you. You think, oh, the Quds Force, that must mean like the special forces or something. No. Quds means Jerusalem. So he was the leader of their most special forces, and their most special forces in Iran is called the Jerusalem Force. Jerusalem is Al-Quds in Arabic. So, again, wonder why that might be. I mean, does the naming of it tell you anything about their intentions of what this force is to be used for? Could it be used to, as the Iranians have long said they want to do, try to wipe Israel off the map? That's something to think about, folks. When you're talking about who we're dealing with here, that's something to think about. Now, this man, Qasem Soleimani, had been greatly empowered by the 2015 Iran nuclear deal made by Barack Hussein Obama's administration, in which Iran got released to them between $75 and $150 billion, depending on who you listen to, of of funds that they could then use to train and equip these terrorists. They also got pallets of cash, if you'll remember, and nothing's more valuable than cash. Cash is king, after all. They got $1.7 or $1.8 billion in cash delivered to them. So wonder what that money went towards. Well, we know exactly what it went towards. It went towards these operations, these military operations through terrorist proxies that they've been conducting throughout the Middle East, and particularly in the Shia crescent of Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Now, we wanted to share another detail with you, and this is one that I haven't heard reported in the mainstream media, and I think this one is interesting, and you may find it interesting too, and that's exactly how was Qasem Soleimani killed, because he was not killed by an explosion. You may have heard that he was hit by some kind of a bomb. Well, he was hit by a missile, but interestingly enough, he was hit by a missile that is the Hellfire RX-9 missile that can be launched from a Predator drone or other types of drones that we use. But in this case, my understanding is they were using a Predator drone at about 50,000 feet. That's 10 miles up. That's a lot higher than most commercial aircraft fly, which tend to fly in the 35,000-foot zone. So this drone was so far up that if you're on the ground, you never would have seen it. You wouldn't have heard it. There would have been no way for you to even see something this size at 50,000 feet. Well, they fired a Hellfire RX-9 missile, which is a variant of a Hellfire that's called colloquially the Ninja Bomb. The Hellfire is about 5 feet long, and instead of having an explosive warhead on the end of it, you'll love this. This bomb has got a specialized warhead that contains 6 blades, 6 ninja sword blades that literally come out, and it's like one of those blenders, that you think about on your countertop in your kitchen. They literally come out and spin around at a very high speed and just completely eviscerate the target. Now, this bomb is so accurate that it can actually hit a passenger in a car on the left side or the right side, depending on which side the target is on. The blades come out, spin around, make mincemeat of the bad guy, and actually the other passengers in the car will not be killed. That's how accurate this particular missile is. So this Hellfire RX-9 Ninja Bomb that was used on Qasem Soleimani was one of our most accurate and lethal military weapons for taking out just a single person, a single target. And that's why you find that the way that they identified the body was actually his hand, and I've seen a photo of it. You may have as well. You can find it on Twitter if you're interested in looking at this kind of thing. It's pretty graphic. But his body was cut into many, many small pieces, and they were able to identify a hand by a particular ring that he wore. It's quite a large ring with a red stone. Again, you can go and find it on Twitter if you're interested in looking at that kind of thing. And that's how they were able to identify and conclusively determine that they did, in fact, take out Qasem Soleimani. Now, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, or as Mason used to say, Khamenei, has already replaced Qasem Soleimani with someone named Esmail Ghani, who's now Iran's most senior military leader. And Ali Khamenei has said that he was going to do 3 days of mourning, so that should be over as of today, and then they were going to respond to this attack. Now, already over some of the Iranian mosques, a red flag of jihad has been raised. So a lot of people are saying, oh, Iran's going to do something violent, do something militarily. And maybe they will. I mean, maybe they want to push the envelope here. I would suggest to them that that might not be the smartest thing to do when you've got Donald J. Trump sitting in the White House. And in fact, President Trump himself suggested on Twitter, again, he has to work through Twitter because he can't count on the mainstream media to convey any of his messages accurately. But I want to read you his tweets because I think it's very interesting. He says Iran is talking very boldly about targeting certain USA assets as revenge for our ridding the world of their terrorist leader who had just killed an American and badly wounded many others, not to mention all the people he had killed over his lifetime, including recently hundreds of Iranian protesters. Just to break for a moment, you remember they just had those protests in Iran, and they killed about 1,500 of their own people who were protesting the regime. So this is not a good regime that's in place. They don't let people speak freely and hold protests. They don't believe in freedom of speech and freedom of thought like we do here in the United States. But let's pick back up with the tweet. He said, and referring to Soleimani, he was already attacking our embassy and preparing for additional hits in other locations. Iran has been nothing but problems for many years. Let this serve as a warning that if Iran strikes any Americans or American assets, we have targeted 52 Iranian sites, representing the 52 American hostages taken by Iran many years ago, some at a very high level and important to Iran and Iranian culture, and those targets and Iran itself will be hit very fast and very hard. The USA wants no more threats. So now we've got the Iranians who are essentially saying that they're going to take some military action in response to the assassination of General Soleimani, and President Trump saying, well, be careful if you do so, because we got 52 sites in your country already targeted, and we're ready to go. And if you try to up the ante, if you try to raise the bar here, if you try to escalate the situation, well, we'll show you what's meant by escalation. We will escalate much further than you will. And by the way, we've got $2 trillion we just spent on military hardware in the Trump administration. We've got a reinvigorated U.S. military. So while we don't want to use it and we don't want to go to war, certainly anywhere in the Middle East, we got to get rid of these wars. As President Trump, he ran on that platform, and I believe he still believes that we do not want to be in these endless wars in the Middle East that are a complete boondoggle for us. But neither can we allow ourselves to be attacked like they attacked our embassy. Neither can we allow Americans to be killed like they've been killing Americans for years, and they just killed an American contractor over there in Iraq, and we cannot allow that to happen. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, the people who should be backing the president up, Congress, they can't do anything except for attack the president. They attack the president about not having informed them in advance. Well, folks, who would inform them in advance, given their extreme disloyalty to this country and the way that they try to use any information that they can get a hold of to try and undermine President Trump and, support their impeachment efforts, which we'll try to get to in just a minute. We want to cover a few other things. But Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has introduced a war powers resolution that she's trying to get Congress to vote on to force President Trump to cease all hostilities with Iran in the next 30 days. Tim Kaine in the Senate has introduced a similar resolution. And again, I don't think President Trump intends to engage in any ongoing hostilities, but we have to wait and see what the Iranians do now, because if they choose to escalate, and we don't know that they were involved in this Kenya bombing that took place just this morning over in Africa, although the timing certainly is suspicious, but we don't know for sure that they had anything to do with that. That was an al-Qaeda-affiliated group, which would be the Sunnis. But, of course, these folks do sometimes work together under the theory of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we don't know that that's related, but certainly the timing is suspicious. And another thing that has happened is the Iraqi parliament has voted to have all troops, U.S. troops, leave Iraq. And President Trump has said we will not be doing that unless they want to pay for that big military base that we built over there. We're not going to just abandon that military base that we built. But certainly I think he would like to get the troops generally out of the Middle East, and I think that would be a good thing. And I think we ought to really seriously consider trying to get them to pay for some of that and engaging in a troop drawdown. Well, it doesn't sound like we're going to get to make it to the impeachment debacle, but we'll try to come back to that next week. We'll see if we have too much international news to cover. A couple of interesting things that are coming up just to get to right before the break. It looks like the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, that's the trade deal that's a replacement for NAFTA, should be passed by the Senate by the end of next week. So we're looking forward to that, as well as upcoming on January 15th is the scheduled signing date for the U.S.-China trade agreement. Apparently, Liu He is coming over from China to sign the Phase 1 deal. So that certainly would be a positive thing to have the U.S. and China get back on the same page in trade and have China stop violating all of our intellectual property. We'll go out there when we come back. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Well, you knew we weren't going to miss this one because we love to go back to the Jeffrey Epstein well. It's the gift that just keeps on giving. Week after week, there's new developments, there's new information. And last night on 60 Minutes, we got some more of that. Now, if you remember, this has just been going on in the news since July or so, June or July of last year, of 2019. In fact, July 6th, Jeffrey Epstein was booked into the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. So it was just before that he was arrested and his story came back to national prominence. Now, the story's been known about really for decades, and in fact, in 2006, he was arrested and then subsequently given a sweetheart deal down in the Southern District of Florida. But Jeffrey Epstein didn't make it very long this time around. If you remember, he went into jail July 6th, and shortly thereafter, a few weeks into his jail sentence, he allegedly tried to commit suicide, and they put him on suicide watch. And, of course, he apparently claimed to his lawyers, and we're getting all of this secondhand naturally, but he apparently claimed to his lawyers that his cellmate, a man named Nicholas Tartaglione, who was a rather notorious ex-police officer who apparently or allegedly murdered 4 people up in New York during a drug deal, I think gone wrong, or drug deal retaliation, I think is more the story. But anyway, Jeffrey Epstein said that his cellmate, Nicholas Tartaglione, is the one who roughed him up and basically put him in a chokehold and choked him out, and that he hadn't actually tried to kill himself. Now, last night, 60 Minutes ran about a 15-minute segment on the Jeffrey Epstein story with the focus on asking the question, although they didn't do it completely explicitly, but asking the question of whether or not Epstein killed himself. And we've certainly heard plenty of speculation on that throughout the past months since Epstein was found allegedly hanging or hung or strangulated in his cell on August 10th of 2019. But we did learn some interesting stuff last night from the 60 Minutes, and I'll call it a whitewash just because they didn't ask the hard questions and they didn't really come down on either side of the question. They had some guests who said absolutely not, there's no way that he was strangled or murdered in his cell, etc. And those were some of their more prominent guests, and they even had the anchor who was leading the segment, asking some hard questions of the guest who posited that maybe Epstein was actually murdered, and sort of leading off with the hard questions. So that's why I'll call it a whitewash. But even with the whitewash, I think if anybody who actually watched the segment, and it's available online, anybody who has to watch the segment has to come away with the undeniable conclusion that something is very wrong with the official story. Something is very, very wrong with the story. Now, what does that exactly mean? Well, it's hard to say, given our vantage point, but I think the evidence certainly seems to lean against the idea that Jeffrey Epstein hung himself in his cell, all the way from the fact that there wasn't enough room for a 6-foot-tall guy to do a hanging, so the actual hanging would have had to have been some kind of strange, modified situation where he tied off a piece of bedsheet to his bunk and then leaned forward into the noose to try and choke himself out, which I would think would be a particularly difficult way to kill yourself because you have this natural instinct in your body to try and survive. I mean, it's what makes you, when you're drowning, still try to swim for the surface to the very last moment. And I would think that instinct at some point would take over if you were just leaning into a noose. But there were all kinds of problems with the story. And one of the featured guests was Dr. Michael Baden, who was hired by Epstein's brother, Mark, to actually participate in or watch the autopsy that was done. And Dr. Baden concluded, although he had to leave it open because he said, we haven't seen all the evidence yet, and we'll get to some of what you haven't seen, but he concluded that the forensic evidence that's available points much more to murder than to suicide. And one of the things that he particularly keyed in on was Epstein had 3 fractures of the bones and cartilage in his neck. Now, according to Dr. Baden, even 1 fracture is unusual in a hanging situation when you've killed yourself, as opposed to when somebody has strangled you. Even 1 fracture is unusual. 2 fractures is very unusual, and 3 fractures is literally unheard of. So Epstein had 3 fractures. He had the left and right thyroid cartilage was fractured, and also the left hyoid bone was fractured. Now, we didn't even know there were 3 fractures. We knew that there was at least the hyoid bone had been fractured, but now we've learned that there were actually 2 other pieces of cartilage or bone-like material that were broken when Epstein died. And in fact, that is so unusual that Dr. Michael Baden said he's reviewed over 1,000 jail hangings in New York City state prisons, and not one of 1,000 jail hangings had 3 fractures in it. And in fact, in his entire career, he hasn't seen 3 fractures in a self-hanging situation. So that alone is pretty powerful forensic evidence that, as he said, points much more to murder than to suicide. But one of the things that's striking about this story is how everything possible, if you believe the official narrative that Epstein just hung himself in his cell, I mean, literally every possible thing that could have gone wrong did go wrong. I mean, let's just review some of them. I mean, the camera in the cell block was not working. The camera was not working. The guards, who've both been charged criminally, were not doing their rounds. In fact, they didn't do rounds after they put Epstein in the cell at about 8 o'clock p.m. They didn't do rounds for 8 hours until they found him at 6:30 the next morning, already dead apparently, and haven't been dead for a couple of hours. Now, interestingly, because they're facing criminal charges, the Department of Justice can't share any of the information it has with Jeffrey Epstein's family, which, just conveniently, they can't get into any of the details. But we understand the guards maybe haven't even been questioned yet. I mean, how about this? There was no photograph taken of the body. No photograph. They come into the cell, they find Jeffrey Epstein dead, they don't even take a picture of it? How about this? The body was not supposed to have been moved under Bureau of Prisons protocol. That was a crime scene. They weren't supposed to touch anything until a full forensic analysis could be performed. But nevertheless, they put the body on a stretcher, they took it out of there, and they took it to the hospital. And for what reason? The guy had been dead for 2 hours. There's absolutely no reason to do that, but they totally violated a crime scene and made it impossible to figure out what really happened. There's a lot more about it, including his roommate was moved out just the day before he was found dead. This is a very strange situation. Go out there and watch the 60 Minutes episode because I think it'll educate you, including some pictures. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.